just want to give, on behalf of Concern and Welthungerhilfe, a really warm welcome to everybody who's taking the time for this important discussion on this, what is the 16th year of the Global Hunger Index. And with the theme of hunger and conflict, it really couldn't be more timely and more appropriate. And we have people calling in from all around the world. And I really would like to also welcome in particular friends and colleagues from Germany's GIZ. We have embassy staff from the Czech Republic, our alliance partners from across the globe, and everybody else. And I think in this week, when the Irish government increased its commitment to overseas development assistance, bringing it for the first time to over $1 billion, the first time in history, it's a really warm welcome to the representatives from the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs. I think we're very fortunate to have Ireland's ambassador to the UN, Germany Bernaysen, who's going to be speaking, as well as Germany's ambassador, Gunther Sauter to the UN. I mean, both governments have a deep commitment to addressing hunger in conflict, and their leadership is clearly evident, and it is clearly critical at this time. I'm also delighted that Dan Smith, author of the essay, alongside Caroline Delgado, is our keynote speaker. Dan was central to the preparations for last month's UN Food Systems Summit, and his reflections will be invaluable as we prepare towards COP26 and the Nutrition for Growth Summit. We've also got a great panel of experts, WFP, the American University of Beirut, our own Concern and Welthungerhilfe colleagues who are going to help us delve into some of the key issues at the heart of this year's report. But you know, Christine really laid it out. It's really the background to today's launch is very stark. I'm not going to go into the detail, we all know the statistics, but we're slipping back into a world we thought we'd left behind many years ago, where hunger is on the rise and an estimated 41 million people are at risk of dying from starvation, literally. So our purpose here today is not just to raise the alarm, but to highlight the solutions that we know exist and they're needed at local, national, and international level. And I think importantly is also to raise the awareness with the media, the public, the policymakers, taking the evidence to drive momentum for change that we know needs to happen. And our commitment here also in Concern is to try and engage with the next generation on the fight against hunger. And we just launched Nothing Kills Like Hunger campaign that we hope will captivate young people and mobilize them. Finally, I just want to say I'm delighted that we're co-hosting today's event with KfW Development Bank, who have been an ally, a co-host, a friend of the GHI launch events in Germany over many, many years, and bringing key messages to new audiences and reflecting the important support that KfW provides across many fragile and conflict-affected regions of the world. And with that, let me hand over the floor to KfW Director Barbara Schnell. Barbara, over to you.
Well, thank you, Dominic, for these kind words. Dear Ambassador Nason, dear Ambassador Sauter, dear Mrs. Thieme, and ladies and gentlemen. Yeah, it's almost a decade ago since we hosted this event with Welthungerhilfe for the first time. Since then, it has become a fixed date in the Berlin calendar of events. And that's not because we are so keen on organizing events, but because the hunger has remained one of the most pressing global problems. Last year, the COVID pandemic took its toll and forced us to go virtual. With COVID-19 still raging this year, we decided to take advantage of this virtual format and open up to a truly international community. And I am also very happy that we made this choice. The pandemic has detrimental effects on all of us. We are all aware of that. The situation is difficult here in the industrialized world, but even more so in developing nations. The pandemic has left more people hungry and malnourished than before. It has interrupted global supply chains and increased food insecurity locally in our partner countries around the globe. Millions are still struggling for their livelihoods. However, as we all know, the pandemic is but one factor. It is indeed complicating the situation and making it worse. But two other drivers for hunger and food insecurity also have an immense impact: climate change and violent conflicts, the latter being the topic of the 2021 Global Hunger Index. Violent conflicts affect almost every part of the food system. They can inhibit farmers from producing and harvesting. They disrupt the exchange of inputs for further food processing because they interrupt access to finance and access to markets. At the same time, and vice versa, food insecurity can also be a driver for conflict itself. Right now, 16 of the 23 food insecurity hotspots are in conflict areas. They include regions with very long conflicts, as in the Central Sahel or the Democratic Republic of the Congo or Syria. But the list includes newly arising conflicts, like the one in Ethiopia, where the Tigray struggle has created one of the most worrisome situations within less than a year. And these are just a few examples. Therefore, support in fragile and conflict-affected regions remains one of the major priorities of the German government as well as KfW. This includes projects promoting peace and security, fostering economic reconstruction, or improving individual livelihoods. In the last couple of years, such investments have increased significantly. Specifically, our commitments for agriculture, food security, and nutrition in conflict settings have grown. In fact, they have more than tripled since 2016 and have built up to a portfolio of more than €1 billion. Often, we combine measures to address immediate needs with long-term changes. In the DR Congo, for example, we partner with the World Food Programme, with the FAO and UNICEF to take immediate care of undernourished children and at the same time support a more nutrition-sensitive agriculture and thus more diverse food intake. In Lebanon, we work with UNDP to create income for refugees from neighboring Syria and at the same time improve irrigation infrastructure in the host communities. In the north of Mali, we finance irrigation infrastructure. The idea here is to improve rural livelihoods and therefore add stability to a very turbulent region. It's not always easy for all of us to be active in areas marked by violent conflicts, but the German government and KfW are dedicated to the goal of a world without hunger. We know that agriculture is often the primary economic driver that helps people to recover from conflict situations. At the same time, resilient and inclusive agriculture and food systems can really help to maintain peace. But looking at agriculture itself oftentimes is not enough, of course. It takes intensive efforts of those politically in charge to end crises wherever possible, on all levels, nationally and internationally. Therefore, enough food for everyone still. I agree with UN envoy Agnes Kalibata, who recently said, hunger is a solvable problem, but we can only solve it by looking at every aspect of the food system and in a spirit of collaboration. Yeah, and having said that, I'm really looking forward to this session, and I hand over back to Christine. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Barbara. That was, of course, Barbara Schell, the director of the KfW Development Bank from Germany. Thank you so much for those remarks. And also thank you to Mr. Dominic Matsoli, the Chief Executive Officer of Concern Worldwide, for the opening remarks and setting the scene for our conversation today. At this juncture, I'd like to bring in the diplomats to the conversation. And we're going to now get a video statement from Ambassador Geraldine Byrne-Nason, who is the permanent representative of Ireland to the United Nations in New York. Let's have those remarks now from Ambassador Nason.
Hello, I'm delighted to join you virtually from New York for the launch of the 2021 Global Hunger Index, taking place most fittingly on World Food Day. Given Ireland's history Addressing global hunger and undernutrition has long been a cornerstone of our foreign and development policies. We have always looked to concern as a critical partner and ally in advancing our work in this field. The 2021 Global Hunger Index, developed by Concern with Welthungerhilfe, is a valuable tool to measure and to track food insecurity. I believe that it will make a substantive difference to efforts to generate advocacy, resources, and the much needed political will to deliver on the SDG promise of zero hunger. Shamefully, we are set to fall far short of that goal, as this report clearly demonstrates. The 2021 Global Hunger Index points to a dire, I would say desperate, hunger situation globally, in an international environment straining to cope with multiple crises. We know that the COVID-19 pandemic, the climate crisis, and worrying disruptions to supply chains have compounded global food insecurity. Yet we cannot and should not ignore that conflict is the single greatest driver of hunger in the world today. The emphasis that this report places on the horrendous impact of conflict on food systems is therefore crucial. Shockingly, man-made, conflict-induced hunger is increasingly a common occurrence. In our role on the Security Council, we are faced with this reality on a daily basis, and we are determined to draw attention to the need for collective action to address it. Alongside Niger, we co-champion the issue of conflict and hunger on the Council. We are resolved to support the agenda, to work for implementation of Resolution 2417, and to stand up for the humanitarian principles and norms which underpin it. We are pressing for progress, including focusing on core elements such as ensuring rapid, safe, and unimpeded humanitarian access in situations of armed conflict. We advocate for the protection of civilian infrastructure critical to food systems. We call for the effective application of international humanitarian law and insist on accountability for wrongdoing. I'm delighted to participate in this launch alongside my counterpart from Germany, whose work as our predecessors on the Security Council we deeply respect and aim to build on. Like us, Germany is an active member of the Group of Friends of Action on Conflict and Hunger. That work, together, indicates the depth of our shared commitment to addressing hunger in conflict settings. Almost 170 years ago, 1 million Irish people died and a further 1 million emigrated due to famine. Generations later, that memory remains deeply ingrained in our psyche. Today, Ireland argues every day at the Security Council that it's wholly unacceptable that millions of people around the world continue to live with the threat of famine. There can simply be no justification for that. As I noted, the eradication of hunger and undernutrition has been a cornerstone of Ireland's development programme since its inception, and today remains a key pillar of our foreign policy. It was only natural then that addressing hunger in conflict settings would become a central priority for Ireland as we assumed our seat on the Security Council. Since taking that seat, Ireland has consistently addressed country and region-specific instances of conflict and hunger. We will continue to do so. Today, millions of men, women and children in Ethiopia, in Yemen, in Afghanistan, in Syria and in the Sahel are not just hungry, they are being starved. They are suffering from avoidable hunger, man-made hunger, with women and children, the most vulnerable of all, bearing the brunt of this injustice and indignity. We are more determined than ever to do what we can to ensure that Ireland's term on the Security Council will contribute to consigning famine to history. But we need to acknowledge that things are not going in the right direction. We have a brief window of opportunity now to generate the necessary political momentum to deliver on our SDG promise to end hunger by 2030. It will take concerted collective action and the reinforcement of the right to food as a starting principle. In pursuing these objectives, Ireland will actively continue to play a leadership role in the follow-up to the UN Food Systems Summit and in the preparation of the December Nutrition for Growth Summit. Let me conclude by most sincerely thanking Concern and Welthungerhilfe for the launch of the Global Hunger Index report. This report calls it as it is and really gets to the heart of the relationship between conflict and food insecurity. The report deepens our understanding of how countries are being impacted by hunger. It offers key policy recommendations that, if implemented, could greatly reduce the intergenerational costs of hunger for families and communities. Put simply, the report is an invaluable contribution and vital to our collective efforts to end hunger. Ireland will not be found wanting in working to ensure that this report gets the excellent attention it deserves. Thank you.
And thank you. That was a statement from Ambassador Geraldine Byrne-Nason, the permanent representative of Ireland to the UN. She was talking to us there from New York. We were meant to be hearing from Ambassador Gunther Sauter. He is the Deputy Permanent Representative at the German mission to the United Nations in New York. He has been delayed in a meeting. It's an important meeting, so we will allow him to join us in the coming minutes to give us his remarks. But in the meantime, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to have a video summary now of the key findings of this year's GHI Global Hunger Index report. The video you're about to see is going to just give us the highlights and sum up the most relevant findings of this year's Global Hunger Index report. And so I'll have my colleagues now from the technical team give us that report, and we will then move forward with our conversation from there.
The Global Hunger Index, or in short, the GHI, is a peer-reviewed report published by Welthungerhilfe and Concern worldwide on an annual basis. Since 2006, the series has measured and tracked long-term trends of hunger on a global, regional, and national level. The GHI raises awareness of the scale and scope of hunger across the globe with the aim to provide incentives to act. Combining 4 indicators, the index measures not only availability of calories, but takes into account diet quality and utilization of food. The country scores are categorized and ranked according to the severity of the hunger situation. Echoing other recent reports, this year's GHI is sounding the alarm. Progress towards zero hunger by 2030 is slowing or reversing, driven by multiple crises such as increasingly severe and protracted violent conflicts, climate change, and the pandemic. While many countries have made substantial progress over the past 20 years, we are seeing a range of worrying trends. After decades of decline, the global prevalence of undernourishment, one of the 4 GHI indicators, is increasing. This may be a harbinger of reversals in other measures of hunger. 10 countries in the higher GHI categories have experienced a rise in hunger over recent years. The world is falling far short of what is needed to achieve zero hunger. Hunger remains stubbornly high in almost 50 countries, with a particularly worrying situation in Africa south of the Sahara and South Asia. The GHI estimates that at the current pace, the world as a whole, and 47 countries in particular, will not even achieve low hunger by 2030, let alone zero hunger. The 3 Cs, conflicts, climate change, and COVID-19, threaten to wipe out any progress that has been made in the fight against hunger. While the full scope of the impacts is still not fully known, millions of people have already lost their lives as a direct consequence of COVID-19. But millions more have been affected by quarantine, lockdowns, disruptions to food systems, increases in food prices, all in the absence of effective social protection. In addition, the pandemic is worsening malnutrition through reductions in treatment, healthcare use, immunization, and antenatal care. At the same time, the climate crisis is increasing food insecurity through higher temperatures, changing precipitation patterns, and more frequent extreme weather events. We have seen the devastating impact in many countries where Concern and Welthungerhilfe operate. For example, across the Sahel, the Horn of Africa, and in Madagascar. In southern Madagascar, the worst drought in decades is currently pushing almost half of the population to the brink of famine. Many communities are not only affected by the pandemic and climate change, but are also experiencing conflict. Conflict continues to be a primary driver of hunger. In 8 out of 10 countries with alarming or extremely alarming levels of hunger in the GHI, conflict is a major driver. The number of violent conflicts is increasing, and they are becoming more severe and protracted. Violent conflicts are destructive to every aspect of a food system. It reduces people's ability to produce, trade, and buy food. Often, crops are destroyed, land is inaccessible or contaminated, agricultural inputs, equipment, and infrastructure are damaged, and labor is reduced due to injury, death, or displacement. At the same time, food insecurity can contribute to violent conflict. So, without resolving food insecurity, it will be difficult to build sustainable peace, and without peace, the likelihood of ending global hunger is minimal. The good news is that steps can be taken to build resilient food systems and thereby help advance peace. This is shown by this year's guest essay authors Caroline Delgado and Dan Smith of SIPRI, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. Their contribution and the overall findings of the Global Hunger Index highlight several priorities. First, all actors must work to enhance the resilience of food systems to simultaneously address the impacts of conflict and climate change, and to ensure food and nutrition security. Second, all actors must base actions on a thorough understanding of the context and strengthen inclusive, locally led initiatives. They must ensure inclusive participation of those who are most vulnerable. Third, donors, UN agencies, NGOs, and local actors should commit to flexible, needs-based, cross-sectoral, and multi-year planning and financing. Funding must be based on needs and not fall prey to security or political agendas. As Concern and Welthungerhilfe, we're experiencing the devastating impacts of the pandemic, the climate crisis, and conflicts first-hand in our daily work. We provide humanitarian aid in the event of acute shocks and stresses, while strengthening resilience and livelihoods of communities in the long run. Together with local partners and communities, we are promoting social cohesion and peaceful dialogue. But ultimately, addressing conflict requires political solutions and societal change. Governments and international institutions must address conflict on a political level. International law must be strengthened, and actors must be held accountable for the violation of the right to food, including in conflict settings.
All right. And that, of course, was the summary. And that, of course, ladies and gentlemen, was the summary, the key findings, if you will, from the report this year of the Global Hunger Index. I am now being informed that Ambassador Zaltner is ready to speak to us now. As I had said to you, he had been held back in a meeting over in New York. He is here now with us, and I am going to introduce him once more to you again. That is Ambassador Günther Zalter, who is the Deputy Permanent Representative at the German mission to the UN in New York. And before Ambassador takes the floor, ladies and gentlemen, I just wanted to remind you, you might have seen it in the chat, that the report is available. You can download it on www.globalhungerindex.com. I'll say that again, that's www.globalhungerindex.org. For our German-speaking audience, www.welthungerindex.de. And that is, of course, the website where you can download that report and really get to see the issues and understand them for yourself. Ambassador, I see you. Guten Morgen aus Berlin. The floor is yours now.
Christine, thank you so much. I'm terribly sorry for being late. I was casting the German vote in the election for the Human Rights Council, and that couldn't wait. It's a great honor for me to be participating in today's important meeting. we are talking about an incredible number. 41 million people on the planet are suffering from hunger. The 2021 Global Hunger Index is revealing this terrible truth. This is at the same time highly useful. The index is an important tool to measure and to track food insecurity. Politically, it's a very important tool to generate advocacy and resources. We do not lack from political frameworks to fight hunger. We do not lack recognition of the problem. We don't even lack the capacities to produce, finance, and deliver food. We do lack, however, the necessary political will to make zero hunger a reality. Food security and famine prevention is very high on the German foreign policy agenda. We currently use 1/3 of our humanitarian funding to deliver humanitarian food assistance, and we will continue to do so in the future. Currently, our focus is on the support for people in Yemen, in Ethiopia, in South Sudan, and in northeastern Nigeria. But we cannot stop here. Our efforts must go beyond humanitarian response. We therefore fully support joined up efforts between the humanitarian development and peace pillars within the United Nations and beyond in order to end conflict-driven food insecurity and hunger. Conflict, I believe, is the most important word in this discussion. It is the main driver for hunger today. It is the #1 source for suffering from hunger and starvation. It's a man-made problem. Therefore, only political solutions can bring lasting solutions and break the cycle of conflict and hunger. We have powerful tools at hand. Security Council Resolution 2417 gives us the right instruments, timely information and reporting on famine risks, the use of early warning mechanisms to monitor risk and to track violations of international humanitarian law. These tools must be applied. We must apply them even more systematically and rigorously. One important part of this is to safeguard international humanitarian law. Accountability is key where international humanitarian law is violated. We must make sure that the costs of breaches of these basic principles of civilization are sufficiently high to be really deterring. This is an ongoing challenge that we must tackle at a political level in the United Nations and beyond. Let me also say, and I think that Geraldine has already pointed this out, the work of the Group of Friends of Action on Conflict and on Hunger continues to be an important driver for this necessary debate. I would therefore like to very warmly thank Ireland explicitly to take this agenda forward, including during the Irish tenure in the Security Council. For us, this was part and parcel of Germany's work in the Security Council in 2019 and 2020. We believe that this work must continue, and we certainly stand ready to do so. This Saturday will be World Food Day. And I think the message is clear for this Saturday and for every day, really. The World Hunger Index tells us very clearly, it tells leaders, it tells civil society, it tells private sector, academia, and diplomats, all of us, where to get started, why it matters, and what to do. I would very much, very warmly like to thank all of you here today for your passionate work on this important issue. Our struggle must continue. There's no time to lose. Let's get on it. Thank you so much.
And thank you, Ambassador Zalta, talking to us from New York there. We appreciate you and those remarks. Thank you so much for that, Ambassador. And now it is time for today's keynote address. And at this juncture, I would like to introduce to you all Mr. Dan Smith. He is the director of the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, otherwise known as SIPRI. He is also the co-author of the 2021 Global Hunger Index guest essay. Mr. Smith, it's over to you now.
Thank you very much, Christine, and thank you everybody for joining today. It's a great honor for us at SIPRI to have contributed to this year's Global Hunger Index with our essay on the relationship between conflict and hunger, and also thus between food security and peace. This is an aspect of our work which we have been developing in recent years, in particular with a close knowledge partnership that we have with the World Food Programme. Let me move straight into the area which the speakers so far have all been raising, which is that progress on hunger has stalled, and on undernourishment, it seems to have gone into reverse. There are various different figures around. The one that we quote at the beginning of our essay are that 155 million people are in acute food insecurity at the end of 2020, and 30 million people on the verge of starvation, meaning they do not know where their next meal is coming from. All of these figures, produced by different statistical methodologies, they are all too high, and they all show the same trend, which is that progress that was very welcome for 2.5 to 3 decades until recently has slowed down and has started to reverse. And that happened before the pandemic. So COVID-19 is now making a bad situation worse, but we need to look further than the pandemic to understand it. The research that's published each year, the State of the World Food Report, by the FAO, IFAD, UNICEF and World Food Programme and the World Health Organization, shows a turning point around 2015, just as the SDGs and the goal on zero hunger were being finalized. So just as the world was coming to one of the strongest and best statements of aspiration, not just on hunger, but on a whole range of other development issues, including poverty, climate change, gender, and indeed peace and strong institutions. Just as that was happening, a turn was being made in the wrong direction. And that same research also shows, and our own research in more detailed cases validates this, that violent conflict and climate change are the major drivers of the increase in world hunger. Conflicts have been on the increase in the last decade, violent conflicts, that is. Compared to 2010, there are now about twice as many armed conflicts worldwide as there were then. I think there was a graph shown earlier in the summary film which revealed this and confirmed it. In addition to the conflicts that involve states fighting against insurrectionary forces of one kind or another, there are also those conflicts which involve states fighting against essentially nobody, one-sided violence. There's no organization on the other side, but nonetheless, there's a huge amount of violence being perpetrated against ordinary people. And also on conflicts which do not involve states at all, which are essentially between militias and criminal groups. All of this has been increasing in the last 10 years. from about 1995 until about 2010, the zone of world peace was steadily expanding. From about 50 armed conflicts in 1990, after a short increase, the number had tailed down to around 30 in the year 2010, and now has almost doubled from that to 58 or 59, where we are today. So we have lost the peace dividend that we gained the years or the decade after the Cold War, and we have also lost other measures and indicators of human improvement, including hunger, which we're talking about today. So what are the connections between violent conflict and hunger? One of the things that we argue in the report, and I think the research validates this quite firmly and clearly, is that the link works both ways. That's to say that violent conflict leads to increased hunger. It does so in part, I would say, for three reasons. In part because starvation is used as a weapon. In part because, as we've heard, farming and supply systems are disrupted by violent conflict. People leave the land. Sometimes the disruption of the farming and the food supply systems happens deliberately, sometimes accidentally. And also there are economic consequences to violent conflict, which means that the price of food goes up as its availability goes down. And this has an obvious effect, especially on people whose cash incomes are low and their budgets are tight and they can barely anyway afford to be feeding themselves properly. As prices go up, it's even harder. So I think that the impact of violent conflict on increasing hunger is devastating, it's tragic, it's also pretty straightforward to understand. The relationship from hunger to violent conflict is less straightforward, but it's no less real. I urge you not to think so much of hunger causing violent conflict in a direct line, but rather think of hunger as being part of what sets the stage for violent conflict. It's often said, and I think it's right to say, that food is foundational for peace. Weaken the foundation and you weaken the peace. So the more that the food security declines, the higher are the chances, the stronger is the risk that there will be a violent conflict. This is because disrupted food systems feed grievance, they feed bad governance, they feed corruption, and they feed anger, and they feed the possibility of people being recruited, because desperate people very often feel, and indeed not just they feel they have to take, but they do genuinely have to take desperate action in order to remain alive, and sometimes to feed their families. Sometimes for young men in extreme circumstances, being recruited, joining up to a militia force is one of the few ways in which you can be sure that you're going to contribute to feeding your families. Indeed, in some places, perhaps it's only the jihadis who are going to feed you. Hunger is not the sole cause of these armed conflicts. The truth is, and this is something which I think as a researcher, I find I have been arguing about this for years and years now, but there is really never a single cause for any armed conflict. Violent conflict is something which is much too serious for people to join in for only one reason. Generally speaking, there is a coming together, a concatenation of different factors which lead to violent conflict. What we see in these cases is a deficiency that's long-lasting or a shorter-term breakdown in social stability, in the governing authority, in people's trust in government, and in the capacity to resolve and manage conflicts relatively peacefully. It's important to make a distinction between conflict and violent conflict. Conflict is not necessarily a problem. You don't get social progress without conflict. The problem is when conflict turns violent. When conflict cannot be pursued and managed peacefully, then the difficulties arise. So there's a range of diverse factors which intertwine and interact in leading to violent conflict. Hunger is clearly one of them. the impact of climate change and other kinds of environmental stresses and other, also poverty and inequality, bad governance, and indeed the after effects of traumatic violent conflict themselves often feed the next generation of violent conflict. This is an explosive mixture. It's been referred to as a toxic cocktail. Unfortunately, the security horizon as we look ahead is rather troubling. To add to what I've been saying, the COVID-19 pandemic has brought on, as we know, a serious economic crisis. In 2020, all the national economies in the world, except for just 20, shrank. Previous economic crises, like the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009, the Asian financial crisis in 1997, the oil price shock in the mid-1970s, previous economic crises have also been followed 2 to 3 years later by an increase in the number of violent conflicts around the world. All other things being equal, one could certainly expect that to be happening in 2 to 3 years' time in 2023, 24, 25. If nothing is done on the conflict prevention agenda to make this, to reduce this risk, there could certainly be more armed conflicts yet to come. The good news, let me get onto that, is that the connections work the other way around. That's to say, while conflict and hunger have a two-way connection, so do peace and food security. You could express this as a task, which it's how it's been referred to already this afternoon, that you need to build peace in order to generate food security. Looked at that other form of that connection. You need to enhance food security in order to build peace. Or instead of expressing it as a task, you could express it as a reason for hope. You can build peace by enhancing food security. You can enhance food security by building peace. And the research that CIPRI has been doing in the last 3 years with the World Food Programme, looking at in detail on the ground at ways in which the World Food Programme's activities contribute to improving the prospects for peace, is the basis on which I am expressing this well-grounded optimism. We've looked at cases so far in Mali, Iraq, Kyrgyzstan, El Salvador, Colombia. That's all published. There's a report on work in Lebanon, which is coming out soon. The report on work in Nigeria is at a relatively late stage in its preparation. And these all show that in difficult circumstances, it is nonetheless actually possible to make progress towards both peace and food security, and that very often the best results are gained by working on both at the same time. Is this easy? No, the news, I'm afraid, is not that good. Right? There are conditions in some places which I honestly have to say I think are virtually impossible for this kind of approach. There are 4 that I can think of straight off the top of my head. Secondly, even where the conditions aren't impossible, they are always difficult. Thirdly, actors artificially divide themselves into different areas of competence. They do food and not peace, or they do peace and not food. But if food is foundational for peace, shouldn't they be getting together? Shouldn't that be an area of interdisciplinary cooperation? And even worse, the funding streams encourage them into these separate silos. I think that a meeting like this is not complete without somebody having to say we have to get out of the silos. But if you want to get out of the silos, you've got to get the funding streams out of the silos first. So what to do? Very briefly and summarize. We need better understanding. We need to have the information and we need to analyze it together on an interdisciplinary basis. We need the policy and the funding with decisions made to cross the silos in action and in the funding streams. And the action itself, we need to be bringing people and institutions together at local level in the countries where the problems are experienced at the sharp end. Get local communities, women's groups, traditional leaders, the government, the international NGOs like Concern and Welthungerhilfe and others, the UN agencies together around the table in hubs of activity on food and peace, facing and dealing with and addressing the problems with the basis of their local knowledge, their technical expertise, and the financial assistance. The work needs to be done flexibly, in an agile way. It needs to be integrating the different strands and streams of thought and addressing the different kind of problems together. And this means, above all, that it has to be done in partnership, in real partnership between different organizations and agencies, learning how to work together. Getting out of the silos partly means getting off your turf. But getting off your turf means finding the freedom to explore this world of possibilities for developing that link, not just between conflict and hunger, we know all about that, but developing that link between building peace and enhancing food security for ordinary people around the world. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation to come.
And thank you for that, Dan. Thank you so much for really laying it all down for us, providing us the perfect segue to get into our panel conversation for today. I'm also thrilled that you're going to stay on and take some questions as part of that panel as well. So just a reminder to all of our friends in the audience that we do have the Q&A facility that you may use to get some questions in to Dan and the panelists that I will now be introducing to you. We are going to be hearing from Rebecca Vitharium-Richards. She is the chief, everybody is coming on now, you'll be seeing them shortly. Rebecca Richards is the chief of emergencies and transitions, the program and policy division at the World Food Program, the WFP. We have Rami Zurai. He is professor at the Faculty of Agricultural and Food Sciences at the American University of Beirut. Amina Abdullah is the regional director for the Horn of Africa for Concern Worldwide. And Louis Dovelier is the country director for the Democratic Republic of Congo, and he is from Welthungerhilfe. I'm delighted to see you all here, and of course, Dan Smith, the director of CIPRI, is staying on to be part of the conversation as well. So let's not waste any more time and let's get right into the conversation. Rebecca, I'd like to begin with you and the perspective from the World Food Program. And just a side note to our audience that this conversation really is going to be in three parts, if you will. In this first part, we're really just establishing the problem in the specific countries that we will hear from today. And then we're going to look at solutions in the second part. Second part has basically two parts, solutions basically at local level, and then we'll look at solutions at a sort of international level and that. So we're spending more time on the solutions, ladies and gentlemen, because that is what today is about. But Rebecca, beginning with you from the World Food Program, from your perspective, what is the biggest challenge for building resilient food systems in conflict settings? I know that you are also involved in CIPRI's research. Just what is the biggest challenge at the moment when it comes to building resilient food systems in conflict settings?
Thanks, Christine, and thank you so much for the invitation. I was listening closely to the interventions before and Dan's keynote, but also the openings from the ambassadors of Germany and Ireland, and they've framed so much of the challenges already. But I have to say that it's easy to say that it's conflict and put the sort of responsibility squarely onto politics. But if you look at the nature of conflict, and Dan was describing this really well, it has become more protracted, and it's so closely now intertwined around local and regional issues related to resources, or the lack of access to resources, and whether that's grazing land for cattle in Nigeria, or the inability to purchase food because of sharp increase due to an economic downturn, like in Lebanon, 46% increase in the cost of food in Lebanon. You start to see that the picture is also bigger than just the politics. So if you look at it through a prevention lens, and yes, the 3 C's are critical to making the situation continually worse, but fundamentally underlying food systems is the governance and ability of national and local institutions to manage resources that are available within society. And their governance defines people's ability, people regardless of who they are or where they are, to effectively meet their food and nutritional needs and to manage the risks that they face. So this is what ultimately underpins the well-being and the resilience of populations. So when it comes to food insecurity, it really denotes a failure of these institutions across different sectors, or the breakdown, I should say, of these institutions, which are entrusted to provide education, social assistance, access to markets, healthcare, financial, agriculture. It's a combination of these institutions and systems that support the production, distribution, and consumption of healthy and nutritious food for the population. And the reason I wanted to frame my answer this way is because it's important to look at the interrelations that stand up an optimal food system, so that we can then look at, well, what are the real challenges? So in my mind, I wanted to build on what's said before, but I find there to be 4 key challenges. First, understanding, and Dan was talking about the evidence base. Really, do we understand the interrelationship of food security with all of these institutions that support the well-being of a society? Do policies in these countries factor that in to be able to support their people? Is food really considered a human right at a national and regional level? The second is coherence. It's that ability to bring all the pieces together, and it can't be underestimated. It is tough, but if we're not working on all fronts, global, regional, national level, right down to local actors, you're never going to get the real solutions that are needed. You're always going to be putting a finger in the dike or plugging one area, but without looking at it in a holistic manner. The third is the importance of having a mindset that peace is possible through food, and that looking at the longer term, even through an emergency, is critical, so that you don't perpetuate a cycle of dependency, but that understanding that we can be contributing to the longer term, even during an emergency phase, is really essential, I think, to be building differently. And of course, finally, echoing everybody before me, it's that political will for solutions where we can talk about accountability and respect for international humanitarian law and human rights law. So that's the package, Christine. And those are the biggest challenges that I believe we're facing.
Thank you so much for that. And I took down those 4 pointers. I'm sure at some point in the conversation, we will be coming back to some of them, certainly, if not all of them. Rami, I'd like to come over to you now. We heard Rebecca mention Lebanon there. We are talking about conflict as well, and you're living in a conflict-affected region of the world. From your perspective then, Rami, why is it important to use a food systems lens when addressing food and nutrition security, or rather insecurity, in conflict settings?
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation to be on your panel. I also enjoyed, well, at least I followed very closely the keynote address, on which I would have some comments, especially in the use of some terminologies, but that can come later. The good thing about a food systems approach or food systems lens, and sometimes we try to conflate with agriculture, or we tend to conflate it with agriculture, which it is not at all. Food production or agriculture is one of the components of a multiple components system that is interlocked and that works, and it is driven by different drivers, among which are political drivers, which are themselves connected to conflict. Now, once this is done, once this mechanistic approach is adopted, one can therefore see and determine what are the pain points that are preventing the access of all the population to healthy food. And one also must note that just to take it from where Rebecca started and take it further, one step further, that resilience is not necessarily what we want in all food systems, because a lot of the food systems are unbelievably unequal and before the conflict starts. So giving resilience to a system that operates and reinforces inequality between people may not necessarily be what we want. I don't intend to make an academic point, but that is important. You look at countries and you understand that the food system doesn't work very well because there are like 4 people who are part of the oligarchy, who are in charge of food imports, who prevent the policies that would allow better production through small farmers, better distribution through, through small retailers. And then you understand that this food system before the conflict was already not providing everyone with their fair share of healthy food. Now, making this system resilient may just add to the injustice that's being carried along with the conflict. I will stop here, hoping that this has clarified some of the issues.
Thank you so much for that. And of course, we will be picking up on some of the points you've made there. That's Rami talking to us from Lebanon. Amina, I want to come over to you now. Just remind our audience that you are from Concern Worldwide, where you are regional director for the Horn of Africa. Can you give us some insights, Amina, into how the climate crisis and how conflict intersect in East Africa, where you are?
Thank you, Christine. I think what we see in the region is a perfect but tragic storm of violent conflict, climate change, and most recently, COVID-19. And it goes without saying that the situation in many of these countries is dire. We've seen, like all the other speakers have said before, that progress made over the years in addressing food and nutrition security is being reversed as we see an increase in the number of people in need of humanitarian assistance. Now, I agree with the challenges mentioned earlier, but from an operational perspective, I think one of the biggest challenge is the restricted access to affected populations in some of the countries in the region. And this is severely hindering the efforts of organizations like Concern, Welthungerhilfe, and other international and local organizations in saving lives. This is not only related to access for humanitarian workers to the population, but also movement of goods. And of course, the effect of that on, that family that is seeking to access food. Where goods are available in this context, they're either heavily taxed by non-state parties to the conflict, or the level of insecurity makes it difficult for traders to move such that if and when food does get to these regions, the price is prohibitive. And we're seeing families being forced to make a very difficult decision in terms of who's going to feed today and who's not going to feed. The other challenge is also around the lack of resources to respond to the growing humanitarian needs. Resources that are available are not just commensurate to the level of needs in these countries. In many of these countries in the region, if we take just 2020, for instance, each of these countries had humanitarian appeals issued earlier in the year. Most, if not all of these appeals have received less than 50% of the resources required to support the appeal. So where does that leave the affected population and organizations like Concern trying to respond to the needs of this affected population? And it is not just about the resources being available, as Rebecca mentioned, it's about the instruments as well. They're short-term in nature, but also where long-term resources are available, there's very limited flexibility within these mechanisms to respond to changing needs. There has to be an understanding of the context. There has to be a true commitment to all the talk we've had about anticipatory action. There's been emphasis, there are papers that have been done to show evidence around the effectiveness of anticipatory action, but very few instruments accommodate this. Where these resources don't exist, resources for anticipatory, where resources exist, there's very little that's allocated to anticipatory action, despite, focused showing us that, despite the focus not being promising. We'd rather wait for the conditions to deteriorate and then talk about allocating resources. And I think there needs to be an acknowledgement that fragile and conflict-affected countries carry the highest burden of hunger and require a disproportionate level of investment due to the lack of functioning systems, as Rebecca mentioned earlier, that are required to address the underlying drivers, as well as the sustained efforts to reach, long-lasting peace. Resources allocated for these countries need to be long-term, and that we also need to acknowledge that there are no quick fixes. So I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you so much for that, Amina. She was giving us the view there from the Horn of Africa. Bonjour, Louis. I want to come to you now. You are in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and this is among the countries that is faring the worst in the Global Hunger Index. This is in terms of the number of people who are affected in the DRC that are experiencing the worst acute food crisis in the world. Louis, please tell the audience today, what are the key challenges to the food system that the country must grapple with? And perhaps, how is the food system structured? And how do the conflicts affect the food and nutrition security in the DRC right now?
Well, bonjour, Christine. Thank you for the question. First of all, let me commend the colleagues also from Concern and Welthungerhilfe that did really this tremendous job in putting this report together. I mean, for me, this is a report that makes us humble operationally and show the limit also of our work on the ground, and pushes us also to find solution and better partnership. The food system in DR Congo, also a broken system, and if you're talking about when Dan was talking about system also that was not working, and now we add different challenges on them. But the system in Congo was articulated around 5 pillars: a social organization, science and technology, but very limited. The environment with an emphasis on biodiversity and the works around the parks, which create a lot of conflict in itself. Public policy, but with its limitation that leave women and young girls behind in those policies, and also the market to complete the loop. Now this system, the way we know it, has been challenged for the last 30 years. It's not today. And one visible driver has been the conflict for 30 years in Eastern DRC. And I was really stunned to see the white paper of the Minister of Agriculture for the UN Food Summit did not address conflict at all. And the word even was not in the report. And for me, I was stunned to see that. Conflict throws out 5 million people into displacement. And of course, out of the lands, 6 million people are in dire needs of food. If you didn't have the entire humanitarian architecture in DRC, commending also the work of the World Food Program also in this region, we don't know where we would have been today. But one of the challenges, even to respond to this problem, is the humanitarian space, which is being shrunk, preventing access to these communities. 11 million people are in need of help. So if you look at the blend of COVID adding a layer into the situation, climate change with the volcano eruption, mudslide in many places in North Kivu and Ituri and so on, and the conflict and displacement And you have the results of a cocktail that Don was talking about that left 20 million people in food insecurity in Eastern Congo alone in this particular situation. So if you are looking at addressing challenges in DRC, you must address the challenge of governance and the responsibility of the Congolese government, to provide peace and security for its own people. So addressing the 30 years of challenge of conflict in DRC and the impunity that comes with it, it's one of the issues that we need to look at. The other issue, critical issue we need to look at is better partnership. Don mentioned that in his keynote. We have a conflict that has been there for 20, 30 years. We try in the architecture of humanitarian architecture, responding to people's needs, but the governance issue, the responsibility of both the international community and the Congolese government to address also this conflict need to be brought up to light, because you have the fatigue after those years. You have other conflicts that pop up, other priorities. The German ambassador just mentioned now of the German priorities for conflict, right now. So you can see Congo is not in the list. So that means that the conflict is still there. So we need to look at those issues and how do we tackle them and finding partnership also to address those situations in DRC. You can go to the list of what people do for supply chain and the agriculture and all the problem that we know with water and sanitation in DRC. But the heart of the problem is not tariff, is not addressing the agriculture production, but the heart is addressing the conflict that we have in DRC and the impunity that comes with it, so that we can find a pathway for peace and security in this region.
Thank you so much for that, Louis. And you've ended off on a note that allows us to open the second part of our conversation. We're now trying to look at solutions here. You've done a great job. Thank you all for sort of giving us a lay of the land in terms of what the challenges are, where the problems are, and what's brought that about. Rebecca, I want to come back to you now and just remind our audience that you're speaking from the World Food Programme. What works, Rebecca, in your experience in terms of building resilient food systems in conflict settings, and how does this contribute to peace building?
Thanks, Christine. So if we look at what works, I think it's that learning process, not just of what works, Christine, but also what doesn't work, that is important for all of us as a community. And we did mention earlier, Dan kindly mentioned the partnership that we have in looking at this particular area of work. And it's new for WFP. And I have to say that the evidence that's come out of the research with CIPRI it's positive, but it also shows us where we need to do better. And CIPRI's been very honest in holding up a mirror to WFP and really getting us to put ourselves forward in how much better we can be doing. But let me give you some of the results, Christine, and maybe also the more recent report from Lebanon, because we have Rami with us, because it's quite interesting, and it's interesting for all of us. We find that a lot of the prospects around supporting food systems in conflict settings does relate to access to natural resources. Not just that, but if you look at some of the evidence that's come out, for example, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, there's a huge water scarcity, and it's been a long-standing source of conflict. So being able to bring communities together from both sides in the rehabilitation of irrigation canals across a disputed frontier is quite important. Now, this is it's a small example, but over time, you're able to see a decrease in tension and an increase in the ability to access water. But if you look, for example, at Bangladesh, slightly different results coming out from Bangladesh. And here I must say our key partner there is Concern. And it's very much our partnerships on the front line that help to build and learn and move things forward when it comes to this topic. But in Bangladesh, there we've teamed up with Concern, with FAO on building up a farmer's market to sell fresh produce. But there it's across both communities, refugees and host communities, and building a level of social cohesion. Now, if you look at completely different spectrum, it's, and we go to Lebanon, and more recently, the model that's coming out there, especially in light of the economic crisis, you start to see that the use of cash-based transfers and the social protection safety net that Rami mentioned before, and I'm talking about the CBT set up with partners by WFP, does create a sense of stability and continuity, and it allows a different choice for families in a quite destabilizing environment. Those cash transfers can also be linked to training programs, to resilience programs, and can also build social cohesion, especially when it comes to Syrian refugees and vulnerable Lebanese host communities. If you look at the issue of traceability of these cash transfers, then there's also a level of trust that can be built and credibility in the program when you think of issues of corruption and diversion, especially in this environment. So there are a lot of promising models on how you can start to contribute to a food system with peace outcomes, but it still needs to be part of a broader package. It needs to be looked at from that question, as Rami was saying, of equity and inclusivity, because we can't be reinforcing inequality. It just creates more issues. And I want to touch also, if I may, on what Amina was saying about access. And that is fundamental. It's sort of at the heart of Security Council Resolution 2417, which is very much central to the group of friends on hunger and conflict that Germany and Ireland are working so hard on. But the issue here on access is that it needs to also be sustainable. Often we have access to a cut-off population once every 6 months. Now, for food security, that doesn't cut it. We need to have those solutions and the tackling of root causes that can really be far more sustainable. So let me stop there, Christine. Some thoughts.
Rami, I'll naturally come to you because I did see you nodding there as Rebecca was speaking. So I will ask you to perhaps comment on some of the points that you would have agreed with most. But the question to you now is, from the research that you've been doing on food and conflicts, what are the key learnings on what is crucial in terms of strengthening resilience of food systems in conflict settings, Rami?
Well, thank you very much. Thanks again. See, there is an important issue here. First, let me just make sure that I am all for humanitarian aid. I don't think that it is possible that when you have a shock or a violent conflict that just, happens to you, there are any way around humanitarian aid. Now, humanitarian aid can come in various forms. It can come through bilateral aid. It can come through international organizations. And let me just say that the WFP has been doing a great job, although I do not work with them for full transparency. But I appreciate immensely the work they've been doing in Lebanon. The problem here, when we talk about a food systems approach, is the following. It's also kind of a philosophical point that can you build a system that operates independently from the broader system that encloses it? And that's a really interesting point. I know it might sound a little bit out there, a little bit philosophical about it, but that explains a lot of the reason of why we keep having success in small scale actions, but we are unable to scale these up to a full scale. And well, the reason is essentially that when we remove ourselves from the global economic system and political system and geopolitical system that encloses our food system, then it is easy to show, relatively easy, it's not very easy, but it's relatively easy to show some successes in imparting sustainability, in giving resilience, in helping women cultivate, 5 kilos of fresh fruits and vegetables per year when it does not really make any difference on their food security in the long run. We can show these, but the problem is, can we scale it up when the global system in which the food system is interconnected and is systemically part of, does not operate in favor of that? And that is the big question that the research shows. Like all research, we don't really produce any answers, we produce more questions.
Thank you for that, and hopefully we can get to some of those questions in our remaining time. Amin, I'll come back to you now. You did a very good job sort of laying it all out for us in terms of the challenging environment and the overlapping crises at different levels of conflict that you're experiencing in East Africa. But tell the audience today, Amina, about how organizations like Concern and Welthungerhilfe are addressing food and nutrition security, as well as building community resilience in the environment that you find yourself in.
I know it sounded like doom and gloom, but despite the challenges of operating in these fragile and conflict-affected countries, it's important to note that resilience building programs are possible. They've been tried out in several of these countries. Somalia is one example. Parts of northern Ethiopia is another example with success. And I would say the success of these programs can be linked to a number of things that are related to the design, but also the flexibility of the instruments. They're linked to, the ability of programs to provide basic level of services, because, as the context itself describes itself, is that services are almost non-existent. Identifying opportunities for alternative sources of income either within the value chain of existing livelihoods or alternative livelihoods. Working on environmental conservation and regeneration of ecosystem. Building, and this is important, building on local knowledge and capacities around coping mechanisms and early warning mechanisms. Inclusion of safety net components that allows vulnerable households to meet some of their basic needs, even as you work on even as you focus on other streams of work that build their resilience to the various vulnerabilities. Like I said earlier, flexibility of the funding instruments that allow for anticipatory action, as well as adaptation of interventions depending on the prevailing conditions and context while implementing. The other important element is the long-term focus in the design of the programs themselves. This allows communities to work on a long-term vision, and the working on a long-term vision is important because it does provide them with hope, but also allows them to negotiate with state actors and non-state actors, rebuild social capital, take investment risks that often do pay off, but also not only pay off, but also create linkages that become pathways for access to other services or investments by other actors. And the other thing that I would like to place an emphasis on is the fact that these programs put a central focus on building the capacity of communities, not only as fast responders in the event of emergencies, but gives them the tools to plan and execute their risk reduction measures within the understanding of their context. Negotiate, as I said earlier, with state and non-state actors when it comes to the implementation of their interventions. Act as advisors to agencies such as Concern in the adaptation of programs that has allowed for the delivery of results in an otherwise very fluid environment. And by definition, resilience programming means designing programs which are holistic, which recognize that communities don't live in silos, that livelihood options, education, safety net, health services, all have an impact on people's food security and nutrition. This holistic joined up approach is essential and is what Concern has done in this context and need to be supported and incentivized. And we can't run away from the fact that both government and donors have a crucial role to play here when it comes to building resilience of communities in this fragile and conflict-affected context. But then again, the focus has to be on nutrition outcomes. For Concern, this is a consistent priority, whether we're talking about agriculture, whether we're talking about social protection, whether we're talking about health. We look at all these efforts from the lens of delivering better nutrition outcomes. This approach works. We've seen the results in contexts that are as difficult as Somalia's. And this is why, the upcoming Nutrition for Growth Summit is so important. The GHI and other tools are showing clearly that there's need for scale. There's need in escalating some of these good results or lessons around resilience building, and that the international community has got to scale up its support.
Thank you, Amina. And Louis, it's really the same question to you. How can we build resilience in places like the Democratic Republic of Congo? And talk to us about the approaches that organizations like Welthungerhilfe that you're affiliated with, and as well as Concern, what approaches are they taking to improve the food and nutrition security in the DRC?
Thank you, Christine. The Welthungerhilfe, the resilience for us start with building the capacity of communities to prepare, to adapt, and to rebuild, but also we look at how do we also switch powers, because in DRC, after almost 30 years of conflict and assistance and support to community, so how do we work with local government, provincial ministries, health zones, civil society organization, to really build those communities and design human-centered solutions that respond to immediate need, but also looking at long-term approaches to withstand shock, to build a diversified food production and so on, and balanced nutrition, which is at the center of our work. We build livelihood also in the context of our work, because we look at in our work the situation of perennial crops like coffee, cocoa in the Congo, which are the best product, one of the best products that you can find also in the country. But the issue of mineral and so on left those products that are really mile gold for the country. So Rami was talking about how do we scale up. It's a real challenge to scale up, but I think that can be done. It's step by step. We need also to put the emphasis and also work with people and meet them where they are at. So what we have been doing also in the coffee cocoa value chain in the country, and we take it as a model in community where we can work and take it throughout different states where we work. Now we do that in Ituri. We're also doing it also in North Kivu, working with communities to bring women and girls at the center of the planning and implementation, and have them own those kind of initiatives. At the same time, working with chefs, with health zone and the government, because this is one of the things that we have seen on the ground. The power of NGOs with the money and the thing that they bring into the communities and we've been complaining for years about the capacities of local government to respond to the need of the people. But the question for us is, what have we done also to strengthen those situations and bring about cohesion and social cohesion also in communities? So the real work also for us is to expand what we are doing today, to get the information out that there are better models that exist, that there are alternatives to the situation of hunger and conflict and so on in the diverse region, and to showcase what works to the funding agencies, to the UN bodies, to people that we can create partnership to scale up those small initiatives that are promising for community, that bring people together, that create social cohesion, and that can be drivers for a good food system that is working, that doesn't let out those landless, those people that are poor, that are working in the system as day laborers, but that don't have a voice also in the system. Those are the things that we have been demonstrating in the work that we do, and the consortium with concern in the Masisi area. We are bringing young people at the center of the ownership of what we do, have them design it, have them own it, and so on. So, and this has been a tremendous initiative, and we are taking this initiative in other states, in other provinces, for us to work with that. So resilience for us is switching powers, switching ownership, and have people really plan it and have community own it. So that's what we are doing. And we think that if we continue to build on that, and we can create a wide range of partnership and support for peace in communities and to establish transparent communities. So those are things that we work in our project and program, because that's what will last in the community. That's what we stay after we go. And we put a lot of emphasis also on that in our programs.
Thank you, Louis. We're now sort of pivoting to the last bit of our conversation, and we're talking about what we'll be doing at an international level. Dan, I want you to get ready for a question that will be coming your way, but I'm going to start with you, Rebecca, because we're starting to hear this term more, the triple nexus, this idea that we need to collaborate or bring together the humanitarian, the developmental, and the peace building aspect in an integrated approach. And I just wondered, what is your take on this approach?
Thanks, Christine. I'm not sure how the audience feel, but sometimes the term triple nexus has us all a little bit sort of nervous, because it connotes so many things, and there has been taken us some time to get to a common understanding. But in essence, it's inevitable and it's necessary. We're in a world where there's less resources, more to do, and there's not enough to stretch the resources to actually tackle the problems. So it's very much along the lines of what Amina was saying, in terms of the HRPs only being 50% funded. You can't think about longer term or build longer term if basic needs are not covered in a sustainable way. If you don't have a strong humanitarian floor, you can't elevate and support populations to move towards self-sufficiency. So that's kind of critical to it. But in terms of an integrated approach, it's easy on paper, it's much harder in practice. But I have to say, one of the places where I've seen a lot of success, and I spent a bit of time there last year, is where Louis sits. So DRC, the triple nexus is actually part of WFP's country strategic plan in a very central way. But what does that mean in practice? And I have to say, Louis, what you were mentioning around the voice of women and girls and people at the center of the design of operations, it's fundamental to any triple nexus approach. If we don't have a clearer understanding of people's aspirations and needs, we're very good at taking our tools, Christine, and designing operations in a way that covers our respective areas of work, food, nutrition, health, so on and so forth. And as we've seen today, it's all much more complex and interrelated. So if you place people voice at the center of the design of operations, it's going to look different to the way that we plan as internationals. And it's interesting, Dan and I have been working quite hard on the Food Systems Summit, and we've had national dialogues that have taken place over the course of the last months. But if I asked an honest question, did those national dialogues include everybody? No, they didn't. So we have to be very honest with ourselves and what the triple nexus means. It needs to bring actors together in a way that you have your complementary approach, but not in a way that we have to subsume each other. And in DRC, you see some great work of Welthungerhilfe, a huge support from the German government in really building resilience in some of these locations that are prone to conflict. But where you see communities come together and they're able to work together, it also becomes a buffer against conflict. It's part of the prevention model, conflict prevention model, when you start to build resilience around food security that expands out at a community level. So there's exciting prospects, but so much more to be done. It's worth mentioning also, Christine, that the World Bank, the IFIs, have a strong role to play in this. They have been instrumental in working with the government of DRC to build a social protection platform. But here's where technical support and the voices of our organizations on this panel can influence the creation of that protection floor in a way that's inclusive and equitable. So we don't have what Rami was referring to in terms of the inequality. So it involves all actors. I know that it's going to raise issues around humanitarian principles, neutrality, independence, and I don't believe that they're mutually exclusive. I think there's enough space in the way we work and collaborate together in partnership can overcome what are perceived to be the risks. So yes, it's the way forward.
Dan, Rebecca talks about the UN Food Systems Summit in September, and I know that you were involved in the process leading up to that. Would you share with us some of your takeaways from that process, perhaps the challenges and the successes?
Yes, I think what the Food Systems Summit managed to do was to bring different groups together. It generated a lot of ideas. There was this appeal put out for so-called game-changing solutions. I think, if one's really honest, a lot weren't game-changing, but it was really good to bring them out from the particular kind of organizational and institutional corners where they had been sitting, and get them out into the light and start to discover some of the synergies between them. I think it put attention at last onto the idea of a food system. If I have a criticism of some of the people whom I was engaged in working with during that the period of the lead up to the summit, it is that while I thought that their knowledge about food and nutrition, or possibly crops and seeds and so on, was just absolutely wonderful, it was divorced from any kind of appreciation, really, about the importance of the rest of the food system. The food system is not just to do with, as Rami was saying, it's not just to do with technical inputs and farming. It's not just to do with nature and the climate. It's not just to do with food distribution system. It's not even just to do with how society is organized and the nature of power in that society. It's to do with the lot. It's to do with it all combined together. And I think that this was something which the Food Systems Summit managed to do, was to get some kind of attention on that, on a more integrative approach. At the same time, to be honest, one of my takeaways is that it's extraordinarily difficult to get the issues of conflict and peace looked at in that kind of setting and explored with open eyes. I mean, time and again, people were saying conflict is one of the major drivers of world hunger and of the problem coming back onto the table. And apart from UN Security Council Resolution 2417, which you only want to discuss in a Security Council context, what is it that is being said in the summit about conflict and peace issues, stability, instability, insecurity, human security, however you discuss it? What was being said there about that whole package of issues? And the answer is honestly not too much. And I think that in that way, the Food System Summit was a little bit of a missed opportunity in and of itself. On the other hand, you then have to say, eyes open, being realistic. Probably most summits are a bit like that. And the point is, what has something worthwhile been galvanized to move forward? Well, I think from my point of view, I wouldn't be sitting here having this discussion, and I wouldn't be part of making conflict a central part of the discussion about the Global Hunger Index now, if it weren't for the Food System Summit, because it's during the preparation for that the encounters occurred, which brought this on. So I think that this is a continuing and unfolding process. I'm not quite sure, Rebecca, is it now 3-4 years ago that we first encountered each other, and 3.5 years ago that World Food Programme and CIPRI started out on this path with the partnership. And it's an unfolding process. These are big institutions, these are big global problems. And as Rami was saying earlier, you make progress on one thing, you make progress on another thing, but overall the context moves against you. That can be true in a national setting. Actually, it can be true in a regional or a local setting, and it can be true in a global setting. We have very successful development projects, but we don't always get development out of it. We have very successful peace building projects, and yet there is more armed conflict in the world at the moment than there was a decade ago. We have some really fantastic work going on about food and food systems, and yet there is more world hunger. And that's because every single one of those problems is more complicated than the problem itself, if you like. Therefore, we go back to the point that I think we've all been making. Solutions have to be integrative, interdisciplinary, and worked out through really genuine partnerships between all different kinds of people and organizations.
Rami, I'll come to you on the part about the UN Food Security Summit there, and I wondered, what would you say is the role that international actors should play in building resilient food systems in conflict settings, and which actors would you say are the most important here?
Thanks. It's interesting that our go-to solution for conflict setting is international actors, right? Because, I mean, there are two possible explanations to that. One, which is that internal actors are incapable of resolving their conflict, or two, these conflicts are truly caused by the international community, or in which it has an important role, and therefore the international actors are called upon to play a role in resolving the issue of food security in conflict and crisis. Do not answer, these are rhetorical questions, and because they tend to show our way of thinking about these particular issues, that there is a solution that is going to come from a body that is external, and this solution is going to bring, peace, the removal of conflict, food security for all the classes of society, even for those who, before the conflict, were actually suffering from inequality in food security. This is not a realistic argument. That's not. The international community, whoever that may be, by the way, I'm going to think now in my head about WFP, is welcome to come and offer its kind support to whoever needs it in the country. But the WFP cannot resolve the conflicts which are at the source of food security. So it can, at best, offer a fantastic and excellent band-aid and help us in dealing with the situation. And it keeps doing that, and it keeps asking for more money from international donors, some of whom, incidentally, also contribute to the financing of the conflicts themselves. So that's actually quite interesting, in looking at all of these issues. And, I mentioned at the beginning that I had, some comments about Dan's paper and Dan's presentation, and these are among them. This is one of them. The fact that the hand that feeds the population suffering from food insecurity in conflict and crisis is often that same belongs to the same body. On the other hand, belongs to the same body that is also feeding those conflicts. Do you want me to list them? Look at Yemen, look at Iraq, look at Syria, look at the entire regions. I do not need to give a lecture about that. Everyone in this room knows this perfectly and hopefully is nodding along with me in this. This is the elephant in the room when we talk about food security, conflict in a world in which we're all interlinked in a global food regime, in which the smallest, the most simple market mechanisms that regulate access to food in each one of those countries have been completely corrupted by our full integration in the international markets. And that, so the international community offering aid, food aid, humanitarian aid, that's great. Thank you very much. Some people, such as UNRWA, have been doing this, not food aid, but other aid for a very long time. But it's because the issue of Palestine is just not going away, right? So UNRWA needs to keep giving that. In other places, such as in Syria, I would call on that same international community to work for reconciliation of the different Syrian party instead of fanning the fires of conflict in there. And I think that would do wonders for food security in Syria. Thank you.
I mean, staying on Rami's point, that humanitarian aid, while it'll alleviate urgent needs, it's not going to solve a conflict. So from your perspective, what would you say is needed so that organizations like Concern, like Welthungerhilfe, can successfully operate within protracted crises to improve resilience, Amina, and livelihoods in the long term?
I mean, it goes without saying that there needs to be concerted and sustained efforts towards resolution of the numerous conflicts in the region. While this is a political process, it needs to include a humanitarian lens by engagement of humanitarian actors in the process and informing the policy decisions. This is to ensure that policy decisions don't negatively impact on the delivery of humanitarian assistance. Unfettered access to affected populations and the respect for the neutrality and impartiality of humanitarian work is important and critical. Allowing for the presence of aid workers and movement of humanitarian supplies in these contexts is necessary to ensure that we actually save lives before we even start talking about resilience and long-term livelihoods. We must place the affected populations at the center of what we do. Understanding the context and local dynamics is critical for there to be sustainability of any program that we implement in this context. It goes without saying that creating avenues for the engagement of communities and most importantly, women, youth, and other minorities in this context contributes and goes a long way in ensuring sustainability of whatever we do, whether it is in peace building or development impact, development or efforts. There's evidence to suggest that the more inclusive, we know the more inclusive the process, the more sustained the benefits or impact of that process. And that the recognition that fragile and conflict affected countries bear the highest burden when it comes to hunger, as they often lack the infrastructure and capacity to address the drivers of hunger. Therefore, and therefore require a significant level of investment. This can only be achieved through partnership that works towards addressing the multiple drivers of hunger, but also conflict. We all agreed, and all the members of the panel have talked about this, that resilience is a long-term process. The funding instruments therefore need to be long-term and flexible to allow for long-term planning and engagement, but also flexible enough to allow for adaptation. And I cannot I cannot mention the importance of anticipatory action, because it will enable us to protect the gains made by such programs in the long term. We've just talked about the Food System Summit. I mean, there have been interesting initiatives that have been proposed from that, and that it is important to commit to resourcing of some of these initiatives, particularly those that are relevant to conflict-affected contexts. One such initiative is, island support for the Westing Reset, and also the Hunger Development Peace Nexus Hub that is mentioned in the guest essay in the GHI report. These two initiatives need sufficient political, technical, and financial support now so that they can make the kinds of changes needed in fragile and conflict-affected countries. It is not a risk-free process, but it is exactly what is needed. And given the disproportionate needs in fragile and conflict-affected countries, we need disproportionate commitment by the international community to invest in these contexts or allocate the resources required for these contexts. Thank you.
Thank you, Amina. And I'm watching the clock now, and we are drawing to a close. And I just want to ask each of my panelists here to just think about your final remarks. And it's really going to be a sentence, perhaps it's a word that I'm asking you for. So have a think about that as Louis takes my last question to him. We're, of course, approaching the end of our conversation, and I do want to thank our audience, those of you who've stayed the duration, and I see that the Q&A is very active, and it's really encouraging. And I see that also we're covering a lot of ground in the questions that we've been getting from the panelists here. So a sentence, perhaps even a word, will make your closing remarks. But Louis, I come to you now, and we, as far back as 2010 already, Louis, the United Nations has documented war crimes in the Democratic Republic of Congo, crimes against humanity. We know of a genocide that was committed there between 1993 and 2003, and these crimes have not been prosecuted to date. But Louis, what role do you think international actors play in such a situation? And how could the accountability of actions for violations of the right to food be supported, perhaps by international players? And you might have remarks as well about the intervention suggested at the UN Food Security Summit and how that could work in the context of the DRC. So it's almost a two-part question for you there, Louis, and then we'll go over to our closing remarks, and then of course our final word for the day. So Louis, if you could, please be brief in your answer now.
Let me try, Christine. First of all, the UN system is really complex, and the situation also in DRC is a complex situation. One thing that we must assume that the UN will do what is in the powers to at least investigate and hold the Congolese government accountable and the perpetrators accountable. The new government in DRC, in its electoral campaign and addresses to the nation, promises to curtail abuses and corruption. And the government promised to end the conflict in Eastern DRC and to establish the rules of law. So that means we have material to hold the Congolese government accountable and make them responsible for what is happening in their own countries. At the same time, I would say, we must also equip and encourage and accompany and support the government in its effort. Because it's one thing expecting them to do something, but also not having the means also for them to do it. We also agree that discourses of the current and the president must also become reality. We understand in what happened in 2020 that both Congolese civilian and UN personnel have been affected by this violence and these atrocities. So it would be a tremendous loss of opportunity if the UN mission left DRC without really shedding light on those situations and abuses. But we have also to understand the context of the country, which is not an easy task for anybody, and the work with the Congolese government also for them to find resolve. Because one of the situations that we have had for the last 20 plus years in the thing, everything has been put on the UN mission. So now, as the government is taking more responsibility, we need to see also where do they place also those promises and make do of those promises. The same thing that happened in the UN Food System Summit recently. This was set up as on a voluntary basis without any binding commitment of the government. So that's one thing also we need to mention. We also mentioned that in these panels that the analysis of conflict and the plight of the refugees and the displaced people were left behind and left out also in this summit. So we need to understand the context of Eastern DRC. It's a context where you have 8 to 10 provinces, almost 40 million people that live outside of the mainstream DR Congo. So these people live in what we call the country outside, the pays en dehors, as we would say in French. So there is a lot of effort that we need to do to bring those people into the decision-making process, into the affairs of the country, and for them really to participate in the development of Congo. So it's not an easy thing. It's not a cookie fit all, but I think we need to wrestle with the government and hold them accountable to what they promise.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Louis. And that is really does it for our conversation today. I did promise that I would allow you each a sentence or a word in terms of closing remarks. And I have to urge you to look at the clock. It's 2 minutes. And I still have to allow for one more person to give us the closing remarks. That is the president of Welthungerhilfe, who's standing by and has prepared for closing remarks. So if you could all unmute yourselves now, and please give me a sentence, a very short sentence, please, or a word even, in terms of what you would like the audience to stay with today from your contributions. So Dan, I'll pick up with you, then to Rebecca, Rami, Louis, and then Amina.
I think a sentence is just too challenging. I think that it's the task of looking for the possibilities within all the difficulties. And the only way to do that is, as we've been talking about, integrative, interdisciplinary partnership. Yes, it includes the long term and so on. But the real point is things can and do move in a bad direction, but there are persistently possibilities for those who seek them.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Dan. Rebecca?
Christine, I have a word, and it's a little bit risky, but inequality. So that's my word in terms of the whole topic of conversation, because it straddles everything. I'm not just speaking about people, but I'm talking about the food systems as a whole. If we focus on tackling inequality, I think we're going to make progress.
Inequality, that one will stick. Rami?
Thank you. Well, my word here is we need a new narrative. We're trying to resolve a problem that's escalating using the same toolbox that we've always been using. We need a new narrative, a narrative that is developed by people who have skin in the game and not by parachuted concepts.
A new narrative. Louis?
For me, it's let's get the word out. These folks did a tremendous job with this GHI. Let's use it as an instrument. Let's start with that. Let disseminate the word and let people know. Probably that would be our starting point.
Let's get the word out. Amina?
For me, it would be focus on nutrition outcomes and the resources to go along with it in whatever we do. Let it be a consistent priority.
Thank you so much for that. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I do want to thank my panelists for the day. I will not be introducing them again, but to you, Dan, to Rebecca, Rami, Amina, and Louis, thank you so much for your insights at this time. I would now like to invite Marlene Thiem to come onto the platform. She is the president of Welthungerhilfe, and she's prepared some closing remarks for us today. So Marlene, I know you've been waiting patiently for your slot, and I also do want to thank those of you who are still in the audience, who are still listening to us as we come to a close. I'm sure you can understand it is a conversation that you can never have enough time for. But Marlene, I will not take away any more of your time, and I'll hand over the floor to you now.
Thank you, Christine, for your good guidance of this long discussions. And esteemed speakers, partners, and participants, we are now about to close this event and to go back to our work. I think more optimistic and more together and in partnerships. We have discussed all the multiple crises we are currently facing and the immense challenges that lie ahead to reach zero hunger and to realize the right to food for all. Against the backdrop of the recent United Nations Food Systems Summit, we have delved into one of the biggest policy challenges of 2021: how to deliver meaningful change for millions of people suffering the compounding effects of conflict, climate change, and the pandemic. The Global Hunger Index, the guest essay by Caroline de Galgo and Dan Smith, and today's discussion do show some encouraging findings. Despite all the challenges, many countries have made some substantial progress over the past 20 years. We have to notice that. And we have also heard how small-scale livelihood interventions to improve food and nutrition security can contribute to building peace even in difficult environments. In our work as Concern and Welthungerhilfe, we see every day how important it is to strengthen the resilience of communities in the face of shocks and stressors. Only by placing vulnerable people at the center, we can truly support them in fulfilling their livelihood needs. But the key element is bold political will and action. States must live up to their responsibility to end protracted crisis and vigorously prosecute and sanction those who use starvation as a weapon of war. For example, with the help of UN Security Council Resolution 2417. In the coming months, we must also ensure follow-up to the UN Food Systems Summit. There are ample opportunities on the international agenda to do so. For example, the COP26 in Glasgow and the Nutrition for Growth Summit in Tokyo, to name only two, where we need to push for accelerated commitment. We have all come together here today with a common goal to end hunger. There is no shortage of ambition, as expressed in numerous international agreements and summits. It is time to make good on these aspirations. I would like to thank everyone who joined us today. We are delighted to welcome the permanent representatives of Ireland and Germany to the UN at today's event. And I want to wholeheartedly thank the Ambassador Geraldine Byrne-Nason and Dr. Günther Sauter for their words and opening remarks. Dan Smith, thank you so much for delivering an inspiring and encouraging keynote today. We are honored to cooperate with you on this year's Global Hunger Index and look forward to continuing the joint work. I thank all panelists, Professor Rami Tsouraki, Rebecca Richards, Amina Abdullah, and Louis Dauvilliers for the vivid and insightful discussion and for sharing your inspiring thoughts and experiences on building resilient food system in conflict settings, as Lebanon, Democratic Republic of Congo, and at the Horn of Africa. I would also like to take the opportunity to thank Barbara Schnell and the KfW Development Bank. As organizations, we share the goal to strengthen rural areas in the Global South. And in this spirit, we have been jointly organizing expert talks on the Global Hunger Index for many years. Thanks also to Dominic McScauley and Concerned Worldwide for your welcoming words today and for the year-long close cooperation, co-authoring the Global Hunger Index and in many other areas of our work to eradicate hunger. I would like to extend another word of thanks to the German Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development, whose financial support is enabling us to continue today's conversation in many countries around the world. Country-level Global Hunger Index events put resilient and equitable food systems on the agenda and contribute to developing context-specific policy solutions. A big thank also goes to Christine Munba, who has brilliantly guided us through today's event in this distant form on the video. And often forgotten in these events, I would like to thank the team and supporters and translators that has been working tirelessly in the background to ensure a seamless and successful event today. Last but not least, I would like to extend my warmest thanks to everyone who took the time to join us today from all over the world. Let us join forces for a future without hunger and with the right to food fulfilled for all on this world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marlene, for those remarks. That is, of course, the president of Welthungerhilfe. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for those of you who've stayed and indulged us as we've taken a few more minutes of your time. Thank you so much. I'm sure you can understand that this was time well spent. We've all learned a lot. We were not able to get to all of your questions today, but we will do our best to follow up on those questions in the days to come. We will try our utmost best. Thank you so much, everybody, and we look forward to engaging further. Please take the message out there. The hashtag is GHI2021, and hopefully we'll be back in conversation together with more inspiring statistics. Thank you for myself, Christine Munda, and on behalf of all the organizers and the team in the background, thank you all for staying the course with us, and we look forward to engaging you further on social media, on various websites. And of course, that website, the globalhungerindex.org, is available for all of you. And for those of you who'd like to access it in German, it is www.welthungerindex.de. Thank you so much and enjoy your day further, wherever in the world you are. Bye-bye.